First of all, thank you so much for coming here this morning. This is my first time in Denmark, so I'm really excited to be here. I flew in from Paris, and I have to say that after a week in Paris and 2 days here, I definitely like Copenhagen more. Ooh. Can I just see my mouse here for a second? Because there's something on my screen that wasn't supposed to be here. OK, so it's still here, but I'll start anyway. So as a freelance front-end developer, I get to work with a lot of clients, and some of these clients know what accessibility is about, some of them have no idea, and so most of the times I'm requested to explain to them what it is and why it is needed and why it's very important. And as a freelancer who has been getting more into accessibility in the last few months, I've been specifically more interested in looking into how the tools that I use on a very daily basis, specifically CSS, SVG, and JavaScript, can help me make the UIs that I build a lot more usable. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about some of those things that I've learned along the way. And my favorite part about all of the things that I'm going to mention today is there are 4 different things. The first part is you don't need to wait for cross-browser support to start using these features today. Even though some of these features have only partial support, you can add them as a progressive enhancement. This is what I've been loving about CSS in the last couple of years and onwards, is that most of the features that have been added have been added in a way that makes it possible for you to start using them today, even if they're not cross-browser supported. The second thing I love about these features I'm going to show is that as a developer, you don't need to ask for an allocated budget in order to use these in your code. So you can use them today, and you can make your interfaces better without having to ask for an allocated accessibility budget. The third thing is that you don't need to ask for a designer to mock up the accessibility improvements for you. You can start using them again today on your own. And the fourth thing is that you don't need permission. So I know that a lot of developers are like, but my manager doesn't care about accessibility. I don't have enough time to do this or that. But as you're going to see, most of these things that I'm going to talk about are things that you can add as part of your daily workflow. Most of these are few lines of CSS or maybe just a couple of lines of SVG that can increase the usability of your interfaces tremendously. So I'm going to jump right in, starting with oh, actually, this is the second slide already. So responding to reduced motion user preferences. So if you browse the web, you can see a lot of examples of animations on the web, especially on Dribble, that show you how cool how CSS or SVG animations in general are. Animations are very useful because they can aid in increasing the usability and accessibility of the interface. Animations can orient and give context, direct focus and attention, show cause and effect, provide feedback to UI interactions, such as loading spinners, error messages, confirmations, demonstrate functionality and behavior in onboarding processes, expand brand, show personality. I'm pretty sure that Sara Soueidan covered a lot of the usefulness of animations in her talk yesterday. And if you browse the web, you're going to find a lot of articles and tutorials by animation experts that show you how you can turn motion into a very useful accessibility and user experience tool. But animations can also make people sick. In 2013, Apple released iOS 7, which included heavy use of animated parallax, dimensionality, motion offsets, and zoom effects. And after the release, Apple realized that much of the animations that they had in iOS were triggering vestibular disorder symptoms in users that have motion sensitivity. People with vestibular disorders have a problem with their inner ear. It affects their balance as well as their visual perception of the world around them. Symptoms of vestibular disorders include vertigo and dizziness, imbalance and spatial disorientation, vision disturbance, and more. And when it comes to UI animations, there are certain types of motion and animations that trigger these symptoms in users and that are specifically problematic. Some of these triggers are scaling and zooming effects, 3D zoom plus blur, spinning and vortex effects, multi-speed or multi-directional movement, hello, parallax, dimensionality or plane shifting, and peripheral motion. Peripheral motion is like when you're in a car and you're looking at your phone or you're reading a book and everything around you is moving, but your eyes focus on that one particular thing. But this whole idea of having things move around you in your peripheral point of view makes people dizzy. It can be too much to stomach for some people. Now, since iOS 7 included a lot of these animation effects, Apple later introduced a reduced motion toggle in the iOS accessibility settings, which enables users to disable a lot of these animations used in the system. Sometime after that, Apple engineers proposed and implemented the prefers reduced motion media query. This media query is now part of the CSS media queries level 5 and is used to detect if the user has requested the system to minimize the amount of animation or motion that it uses. It's essentially the web implementation of the reduce motion toggle in iOS. This kind of query is also known as a user query. So media queries that respond to user preferences are called user queries. Now, we as web designers and developers can use this feature to create styles and serve alternate animations. So if the user does not like what we have in our UI, they can disable it, and we can make sure that we disable those animations in the code if they request to do that in the iOS systems. Now, a very simple example might look like this. So if the users have reduced motion option enabled in their system preferences, the browser will parse and apply the code in between the @media query in the second part of the code, letting you provide an alternate experience for those users. And now in this example, the animation duration has been reduced to 0 inside of the media query, effectively canceling out the entire animation. Now, in real life, you will probably have multiple animations that need to be stopped. Having to reset every single animating element in a very large application can get easily out of hand and become a maintenance nightmare. Now, this is where CSS variables come in. Using CSS variables, you can write code that responds to users' preferences and your preferences as well in a more elegant and more maintainable way. CSS variables, they are like CSS custom properties are known as CSS variables, but when you talk about CSS variables, you're talking about CSS properties. So if we go back to the previous code, how can this code be improved with CSS variables? So we have multiple animations, each of these multiple elements, each element has an animation, and you want to be able to cancel the animation for all of those elements in a more maintainable way. First, you need to declare a variable for the value that changes about the element in the media query. In this case, it's the animation duration. So you create a variable for the duration, and then you call it in the animation property value and change the value of that variable in the media query. So inside of our element, I define a variable, and I call it inside of the animation. To call or to use the value of a variable in CSS, you have to call it inside of a var function. And then inside of the reduced motion media query, I cancel out that animation by setting the variable to 0. Now, one of the things to remember when refactoring code with CSS variables is that the only value that is changed in the media query, the only thing that you should change in the media query is the only value that actually changes about that element. And in this case, it's the animation duration. But remember that we have multiple elements on the page, and we need to cancel out the animations for all of those. So how about if you have to go and define a variable for each of these elements, you're still not very much maintaining it in a good way. So how about declaring a global variable and then changing that variable for each of the other elements? So global variables in CSS can be declared by defining those variables on the root element, the father of all elements. And since CSS variables are actually custom CSS properties, they, just like other CSS properties, they are subject to the rules of the cascade and the inheritance. So if you define a variable on the root element, it's going to be inherited by all of the other elements on the page, unless you override it for each of those elements. Now, but what the above styles are doing is cancel out the animation duration on the element. So if you have another element using this variable, you'll have to cancel it for that element as well, which means that you still have a lot of repetition in that case. So the code can be improved even further. Now, instead of zeroing this variable out for every element, you can do it once on the root element itself, which is much cleaner and DRYer. Now, defining and changing the variable value in one place like this makes it a lot more easier to maintain and to manage and to read also as well. So you may be wondering, well, this works very well if all of the elements on the page have the same animation duration, right? But how often does that happen? It's probably not going to be the case in a real-life project. The good thing is that you can still keep this structure and change the value of the duration element for specific elements on the page. So let's do it for the second element. What we're doing here is using the calc function. So I have the variable, which is my base value, and then I'm changing that variable, adding, multiplying, and creating a new value out of it by using the var function inside of a calc function, which you can definitely do. So you can have one variable, one global configuration variable defined on the root element. You can use it everywhere on the page that you want. And then you adding just one CSS media query rule, the reduce motion media query, which enables you to disable all of the animations on your product if the user wants you to do so. Just a few lines of CSS and very manageable. So to sum this section up, the main takeaways are that motion can be a great tool for increasing usability and engagement, but certain effects are you have to avoid certain effects that are not good for your users. And the most important thing is to remember that the web belongs to the user, not the author. So always adapt your site to fit their needs. And since we're talking about adapting sites to users' needs, another thing you can do to improve the usability of the product is to provide options that responds to users' needs and preferences in addition to the reduced motion media query. More specifically, I want to talk about providing options to customize the look of the interface and the user's needs, and in this case, customizable type. This section contains some really cool and interesting stuff that I'm super excited about. I can't wait to get to them. Now, yeah, I know. I mean, it's exciting. Now, one of the most common small UI adapters are font size adjusters. Many UIs out there usually offer this in the form of a couple of options. Mostly, I see these in native applications. In a couple of options, small and large, as the example in the video does. So using CSS variables, there is a reason I'm going to go through this. Okay, so I'm starting with a very basic example and a slightly better example, and then I'm going to tell you not to use any of these and use something better. So using CSS variables, creating such a text size adjuster is fairly simple. You can start by defining the default font size inside of a variable on the root element again. Just a quick and more important note about the syntax that I'm using for the font size value here. I'm using calc to combine the viewport units with fixed units. In this case, it's pixel values. For those of you who are not familiar with viewport units, a viewport unit is a unit that is set relative to the size of the viewport. So if you set 1 VW, it means 1 viewport width or 1% of the viewport width. So if I set the value to 13 pixels plus 0.5 viewport width, it means 16 pixels plus 0.5% of the current viewport width. So if you set the font size using viewport units, if the viewport becomes smaller, so does the text. An example is a heading whose size is set to be equal to 10% of the viewport width. The main downside to using viewport units is that the text size can get easily out of hand. So it can get very small on smaller screen sizes and very large on larger screen sizes. Ideally, we would have a minimum font size and a maximum font size. We will have min font size and max font size in CSS in the future, so that's something to look forward to. But at this time, we don't have that. So Mike Riethmuller, an Australian web developer, came up with a brilliant way to use the techniques that we already have, which is more specifically viewport units with a calc function, in order to come up with something similar to minimum font size and maximum font size. More specifically, this is the value that I was using in my example before. So when you combine viewport units with fixed units like that, what you're essentially doing is you're telling the browser to set the font size to be equal to 16 pixels plus some percentage of the viewport. So you're essentially starting with the minimum font size and then adding some percentage of the viewport width to that font size. So if the viewport width becomes larger, the font size becomes larger as well. If it becomes smaller, the size becomes smaller, but it never goes beneath 16 pixels. Now, you can take it even further and set a maximum font size by specifying a range within the calc function. The formula is a little bit more complex, but certainly not difficult. I was able to memorize it, I think, for 4 minutes, and then completely forgot it again. I can't get into the details of this formula because it's outside the scope of this talk, but using this formula, you can set a minimum font size, a maximum font size, and tell the browser to scale the text between those two values in the range of a minimum and maximum viewport size. So back to our example, I set a default flexible font size on the root element and changed the value of that font size variable when the root has a large class name applied to it. And then I use that variable in the page anywhere I want, for example, on the body element, and then you can create another font size that is based on this font size. So effectively, you can establish a responsive scale that is based on that base font size. And once again, if the root has the class name large applied to it, probably using JavaScript upon user interaction, the main variable changes, and so all of the type on the page changes as well. Realistically, providing just 2 font sizes is not as accessible as it can be, because what if the user doesn't like the sizes that you've provided? And I rarely ever like sizes that are provided, predefined. So you can provide something different. So instead of providing just 2 options, which probably are going to be radio buttons, you can provide a range of font sizes using the range element, the HTML5 range element. You can specify the minimum size, the maximum size. You step through these sizes one by one, and the initial value is 13 pixels. you can do that. So using the range element, you can give the user more control over which size they want to choose. But this technique would be very clunky if we had to add and remove class names to our HTML, to our HTML root element with every change on the range element, right? So thanks to the live nature of CSS variables, there's a better way that you can dynamically change the value of the root element, the font size on the root element, without having to add or remove class names. You see, CSS variables are unlike Sass variables, they are live variables and they are available at runtime. So if you want to change anything about a Sass or less or preprocessor variable, I say Sass because I use Sass, and it's because it's easier to say. If you have to change a variable, a Sass variable, you're going to have to do that in the style sheet, compile the style sheet, and then you're going to get the compiled CSS, and the variable is not going to exist in that CSS. But CSS variables are properties, and a property is still going to exist on runtime after the CSS has been compiled. So what you can do is, you can listen for when the value in the range slider changes, and then we set the value of the base font size variable using JavaScript on the root element. Now, CSS variables can be set and unset using JavaScript because they are properties, and you can set the values of properties using JavaScript. And they can be inlined inside of a style attribute, again, because they are attributes, and because they are properties, and properties can be inlined. Of course, you can use local storage to save the user's preferences for subsequent visits, and then you're all done. Now, you probably are not going to do this, okay? But before I move on, I want to mention something important. First of all, this is a video, and I want you to pay attention to that part over here. So in this video, I'm trying to zoom the text using the default zooming capabilities of the browser. I'm zooming it in and out, but the size of the text is not changing. Because if you use viewport units alone, without combining them with other units, the browser is going to fix that font size to that font size that you have chosen. And so basically, you're going to take away the ability of the user to scale the text up and down. To fix that, you need to combine the viewport units with another units, which makes them flexible again. So one of the most important things to do if you're going to build an accessible product is to not break the accessibility, the default accessibility that comes on the web. If there's one thing that you should focus on is don't break the default accessibility and then start adding your own. Now, providing a text size adjuster is realistically not something that that most of us will do, though, because the browser already provides us with a way to do that. Now, there's something better and much more useful that we can do that we can do because we now have variable fonts, which is one of the most important and most exciting additions to the front end and web design today. It will allow us to create type that's more user-friendly and more responsive than we've ever been able to do. So I'm going to show some of those examples, some really cool examples in this section. So quick introduction to variable fonts. For those of you who are not familiar with it, a variable font is a single font file that acts like multiple fonts. The variable font stores multiple variations of a font family. So you don't have to have and load multiple font files for different variations of the font. You can just load one font file and then choose which variation of the font you want to use using your CSS. Now, so therefore, the first advantage to using CSS variables, to using variable fonts, I always mix these two together. So the first advantage to using variable fonts is that it improves the performance of your websites tremendously, because instead of having multiple font files that add up to a really big size, you can have just one font file. Improving the performance is the first step in improving the user experience. Now, variable fonts use the concepts of axes to determine the variable aspects of or characteristics of the font. For example, this image shows the Acumen variable font rendered in 63 different styles, all from one file. The image shows the width and weight variations of Acumen along the width axis and the weight axis. Now, you can combine different versions of the font, morphing between different styles. For example, you may change the width, but not the weight, or you can change different axes, but not another. So basically, you will be able to create almost endless, not really endless, but really large variations of a font size, all from one font file. There are 5 axes predefined as 4 character tags in CSS: the weight, the width, the italic axis, the slant, and the optical size. The font can have variations along any of these axes, and the more axes it varies on, the more varying instances you can have. Now, in addition to the 5 registered axes, you can define your own axis of variation with your own 4 character tags. This enables us to vary almost any aspect of the font size, such as X height, serif shape, grunginess. You can also vary only one part of the text. I'm going to show examples. So, for example, the following video shows the Amstelvar variable font that comes with a grade axis, one of my favorite axes with variable fonts, which enables the variation of the weight of the characters without affecting their width. So sometimes, at the beginning of the video, you saw that if I change the weight, the breakpoints of the words change. But if you change just the grade, you can increase the weight of the font without affecting the breakpoints, which is pretty cool because at some point, if you want to use this feature to allow your users to modify the weight without it affecting your layout, you can do that by changing the grade axis. I almost never drink water in the middle of my talk. I barely breathe. OK, so using variable font variations in CSS is very straightforward. Remember the 4 character tags that I mentioned before that define the variable axes? This is how you use them. So you want to define the width and the weight and the optical size. You use those 4 character tags followed by the value that you want to use. And defining variable fonts in CSS is also straightforward. It's almost the same as the way we currently define fonts using the @fontface rule. But the most relevant thing you may notice in this declaration is the value of the font weight property. So instead of just using one value, you're using a range of values. And this is how you can take advantage of the weight axis because if you just define one value, then you're not using that axis and you're not using that range anymore, which doesn't make it variable anymore. Now, with variable fonts, your weight doesn't have to be limited to multiples of 100. So it doesn't have to be 300, 600, 900, whatever. It can be any value, such as 286, for example. It can be any integer in the range between 1 and 1999. Now, support for CSS variables isn't at its prime time yet, but variable fonts do render in browsers that don't support variable fonts. So as I mentioned before, you can use all of these features as an enhancement today. And if you need to provide fallback, you can do that. But even though the variable font does render in non-supporting browsers, you have no control over which variation of that font is going to be rendered, right? So to get around this, you need to serve the non-variable, the single-style fonts to those browsers if you have to support those browsers, or if you have to optimize for those browsers. You can define all of the font rules and then apply the variable font within a supports rule as an enhancement. You can also do it the other way around and place the @fontface declarations inside of a supports rule. Either way, knowing that all the browsers that support CSS variables also support the @supports feature detection, I think it's the best or the way to go to use CSS variable fonts today is to use them as a progressive enhancement with the @supports rule. There are a lot of variable fonts currently available. You can find a large collection at vfonts.com, variable fonts. I'll just show a few examples of some of the fonts available and how you can tweak them and change them. So the first 2 are kind of basic, but it gets a little bit more exciting as you go lower. Now imagine if you have an interface like this that you provide to your users and allow your users to adjust the type to their needs, to make it more readable for them. This is one of my favorites. So by changing the yeast, no, not the yeast. Oh, that was a different one. So there are a ton of variable fonts, and there are a ton of ways that they vary, and super exciting things that you can do with them. There are also other playgrounds created specifically for playing with variable fonts. One of them is the Access Praxis, which I think was the first one. The Type Details font playground as well. And the good news is that variable fonts are currently available in Adobe Photoshop and in Illustrator as well. Now, how do variable fonts help with making the web type more accessible? By giving control to the user, as we mentioned before. Now, a while back, I saw this article by Adrian Rosselli. It's called Variable Fonts and Dyslexia, in which he talks about how variable fonts can be used to make type more accessible for users with dyslexia. In the article, Adrian says that some people with dyslexia report different challenges than others, ranging from typefaces to page layout to other factors. Dedicated typefaces, on the whole, do little to help readers with dyslexia. Generally, readers perform better when good typography practices were followed. In the Web Accessibility Content Guidelines version 2.1, there is a new success criterion related to readability. Basically, in order to make your text more readable, you need to follow some specific rules, including the line height needs to be at least 1.5 times the font size, the spacing needs to be at least 2 times the font size, letter spacing 0.12 times the font size, and word spacing 0.16 times the font size. Now, today, with these practices combined with variable fonts, you can enable users to control how to adjust the text so that they get the optimal reading experience. Adrian has a couple of live demos. For example, I forked one of his demos in order to create this one. So one of the most useful things the user will be able to adjust is the X height, which makes text sometimes readable or less readable depending on the user. They can also change the weight without affecting the layout or the design. The ascender and ascender heights, look at the K, the D, the H, the T, how they go up and down, and you can also change the descender height. Changing all of these attributes or characteristics of a font can make it very much more readable to a lot of users, especially those with dyslexia. Now, when combined with user media queries, variable fonts have the ability to allow type to adapt and respond to screens, environments, and our devices' technologies. Now, just a quick credit, the following slides I borrowed from Mandy Michael, who gave a fantastic talk about variable fonts last week in Paris. So credit to her for the next few slides about variable fonts. So you can create type that responds and adapts to things like screen width. So you could tweak the font weight, width, or optical size, or other axes to be more readable or smaller on larger or smaller screen sizes. Increase the weight, decrease the weight, depending on the size and the size of the text. Since variable fonts are based on variations in numbers, those numbers can be animated and designed to respond to almost any event, including scroll events. And using JavaScript and utilizing the device sensor API, you can detect changes in device position, and then you can make your type respond to those changes as well. Those characteristics, those axes, you're changing numbers, and numbers are animatable, and they can respond to different events and stuff like that. So it is very much possible and not difficult at all. One of my favorite and most exciting things in the area of accessibility is the ability to adjust the font size based on your distance from the screen, which is also super useful. So in this case, you can see that some words become smaller and other words become larger. And also one of my favorites is you can have the font respond to the audio input or the sound of your voice if you want it to be larger or smaller. Now, with the growing use of devices like Google Home or Alexa, voice recognition, I'm coding Mandy in this case, voice recognition is becoming more prevalent. Something like this could be incredibly useful in conversational UIs and visually representing the tone or intent of a person's input. You can also detect using the sensors. You can also recognize the environments our users are in and allow us to move towards better font legibility and readability. We can create more sufficient contrast based on the user's environment or current experience. As you can see, the weight of the text changes depending on the lightness of the screen. I'm going to skip this one, actually, because now, this is also one of my favorite demos. This is not super useful, as Mandy also mentions, but you can this is, the text is just real bad, sorry about that. So also part of the CSS media queries level 5 specification, we have the preferred color scheme dark, which we can use today with the latest Mac OS and Safari and technology previews. You can detect whether or not the user has enabled the dark mode on Mac OS and then change your fonts as font or text or type based on that. So in this demo, which is not super useful but is super cute, Mandy has the text ooze in a dark mode and then unooze in a light mode. This is not very practical, of course, but it's an example of how you can have your type respond to the user's environment. And using variable fonts, that is super easy. We can improve the readability and accessibility of our content using variable fonts, and this gives us a level of control that is unprecedented. And it's super exciting. Now, another thing that you can do, in addition to, so we've talked about allowing users to control whether or not the animations will be played. We've talked about text size adjusters, font, type variable fonts. Now, in this section, I want to talk about colors in particular. We talked about the dark mode just for a split second right now, but I want to talk a little bit, and I want to get into a little bit more detail. So just like in the previous section, the process is straightforward. You can set up initial variable values in CSS and then mark up some HTML, listen for when the user interacts with it, and change your interface accordingly. Now, it would be useful if we could provide users with the ability to switch to a high contrast theme or a dark theme, which is more user-friendly or in darker environments. The CSS media query's level 4 specification introduces a new media query, the light level media query, which has been deferred to the media query's level 5 specification. This media query is used to query about the ambient light level in which the device is used to allow you to adjust the style of the document in response. Now, again, using CSS variables, it is possible to respond to it in a very elegant way. You can define a set of main colors on the root element, use those colors anywhere you want in the design, and then change their values in different contexts. In this case, it's within the light level media query. Unfortunately, this media query currently has no browser support, so it's one of the things that you can look forward to in the future to make your interfaces more inclusive. Now, I want to talk about something slightly different. Since we don't have a native way to control or to provide a theme based on user preferences, we can do something else by providing sort of a theme switcher, because providing options to users is one of the main principles of inclusive design. Giving a user choice of color modes or themes allows them to personalize the interface not only according to their personal preferences, because maybe they don't like your color scheme, maybe they don't like your taste in colors, but it also allows them to customize the theme based on their needs, not just their preferences. Now, night modes are particularly useful because they make reading in the dark easier on the eye and can help avoid things like migraines or light sensitivity disorders. And all of this can be done in a performant way because, again, using CSS variables, you can make the changes to the theme without requiring an extra HTTP request for a different style sheet. This technique works. So when we talk about providing dark themes in general in CSS, the first thing that developers usually always shout in my face is use the CSS filter invert function. This technique works by inverting the colors of the UI using the invert function inside of a filter, as you can see in the last in the first one on the HTML. So if you have a white theme and you want to invert it, you want it to become dark, you can invert the colors using the invert function. Albeit possible, this technique is probably not the best way to do this because I applied the invert filter to the code website as a test when I was creating the slides for this talk. I noticed that you need to do a few things to make this technique actually work and give you some acceptable visual results. First one is that all the elements need to have a background color so that the browser can invert that color. If a container does not have a background color, you're going to end up with this. So the text color has been inverted, but the background has no color, so it was not inverted. So we need to do that. And you also want to uninvert all of the images, because otherwise they look bad. So that's a couple of things if you absolutely just want to use this. But the most important downside to this technique is that, as you can see already, this technique causes a lot of jank. Did you see the jank already, or do I have to wait to scroll again? OK, I have another video anyway. OK. So jank is any stuttering or choppiness that the user experiences when there is motion on the screen, like during scrolling, for example. And this jank problem is something that I not only saw on the code website, but I also applied the inversion to the Smashing Magazine website and to my own website and noticed the exact same choppiness. See this red area? This is choppiness and this is jank. This is only caused by applying the invert function to the page. It's not performant. So the takeaways here are that invert colors is handy, definitely, but using it has performance can take a serious hit and cause page jank on scroll. And the most important thing is that color inversion does not increase the contrast of the colors on the page. So if the colors on the page are not accessible to begin with, they're not going to become more accessible. Even if they can get easier on the eye in dark environments, they're still not accessible. So before starting to theme your UI, you need to make sure that the colors that you start with are accessible. And this is particularly important because all of the subsequent themes, so if you're going to create different themes, all of the subsequent themes can be affected by the accessibility of the default theme, particularly if you use HSL to define those themes. So HSL is currently my favorite color format in CSS. It stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. A hue is specified as an angle within the color wheel relative to red. Red starts as 0 and the other colors along the 360 circle. Once a hue is specified, oh, the video is not working. It's not. Okay, plain. Once the hue is specified, that hue can be tweaked by adjusting the saturation and lightning levels, similar to what's possible in graphics editors. HSL because of this, makes creation of colors and related colors, or colors that are defined relative to other colors, a lot more easier. You can create multiple variations of the same color by changing the saturation or the lightness. Now, in this case, if we were to apply that to code, I can start with a theme defined on the HTML element. I have the hue variable. Here, the main hue, I have an accent color, and then I'm using those colors to define all of the other colors on the page, the header colors, variations, etc. I can do all of that. And then in the dark theme, on a dark theme, for example, in order to activate the dark theme, in this case, I'm using data attributes. And if the data attribute is set to dark, I change the value of the lightness and the saturation on all of these colors. So if you look at the header background color, the lightness is 50%. I decrease the lightness to 35%, in this case, to create the dark theme. Again, once you've got the colors in place, you can have the user choose which theme to choose, and then you change the values of these variables, etc., using JavaScript. So seeing that code in action, it looks like this. I'm not a designer, so this looks terrible. So don't judge. Now, this technique where the dark theme is created by preserving the hues. I did not change the hues. You can create completely different themes by changing the main hue and the accent hue, only just doing that. Now, in this case, I want to create a dark theme by darkening the lightness of the colors. You can also create different themes, as I mentioned, but let me just repeat this video. There's something not right about it. Can you pinpoint it? Icons, exactly. So the reason the icons were not affected by the color inversion in this case is because I was using these SVG icons as a background in CSS. And when you use SVG icons as a background, the SVG images are not going to be searchable, they are not going to be searchable, selectable, accessible because they are background images, but they also cannot be styled or animated from the CSS. So in this case, I could not style them, I could not change their colors in CSS. And you can, however, work around that using CSS filters or CSS masks. I do not recommend using the CSS filters technique because it's very clunky, and even though it works, it takes a lot of guesswork, and I don't like that. So let's talk about how you can use CSS masks to work around that. So when using CSS masks, the SVG shape, the icon, becomes a mask. So instead of using the SVG icon as a background image in CSS, the SVG icon becomes a mask. The mask is used to clip the element that it's applied to the shape of the icon. This will clip out any text, borders, outlines, and content in the element, which is not desirable, of course. So in order to avoid that, you create a pseudo element on your element, and then you apply the mask to that element. You position the element and you tweak the alignment, the size, etc. The background color of the pseudo element determines what the color of the icon will be, and you can use gradients. And this technique only works for monochrome icons. This is all doesn't make any sense if you don't see it in a working example. So in this case, I'm starting with an SVG that is used as a background image. We have all of these background properties: position, repeat, size. I have an outline added to the element just so you can see the element that I'm applying the background to. Now, I want to start by turning this SVG into a mask. Now, the best thing about SVG mask properties is that you have the exact same properties for SVG masks as you have for background images. So you can just replace background with mask, and the element has just been clipped into the size of the icon. Now, if you give a background color to the element, which was the whole rectangle, you can see that it's been clipped to this small area here. Now, in order to avoid this, you demote the mask into a pseudo element. So I apply a pseudo element to my original element. I position it, give it a display block, width and height. And as soon as you give it a width and a height, and you have applied a mask to it, you end up with your icon. Of course, in this case, you're going to have to start with tweaking it, the size, etc. Just a quick note about the width and the height. Setting the width and the height to 1em means that you're setting the size of the icon to be relative to the font size, which means that if the font size gets bigger, so does the size of the icon. And then you can do the same thing for other icons on the page. Unfortunately, browser support for CSS masks sucks. And it's not getting any better. So this is, again, usually I just say that in a very depressing way, but since the theme of this conference is the future of, so being a little bit more optimistic, this is one of the things that you can look forward to in the future. Now, that said, if the icons need to convey information, if they are critical icons, it's best if you do not implement them as background images in CSS at all. Another reason to inline, generally speaking, when it comes to accessibility, the best practice today for using SVG icons is to inline them in your HTML. That's the best practice. Whether you create an SVG sprite and then inline icons from that sprite or not, it doesn't matter, as long as those icons are inline. Another reason is that if the user is in a specific context or in an environment that removes background images, and if your icons are critical and they are going to be removed in that particular environment, you're going to lose them and they're going to lose all of the meanings, all of their meaning. You see, whether or not you provide users with a dark theme, and particularly, especially if you don't provide them with an accessible theme, and if they need an accessible theme to be able to work with your product, they're going to resort to something else. Usually, like we saw in macOS, we now have a dark theme. In Windows, we have Windows High Contrast Mode, and this is what I want to talk about shortly in this section. So starting from Windows 7 and IE 10 and MS Edge, Windows provided users with a high contrast mode, which is designed to help people with contrast sensitivity issues. When high contrast mode is activated, the colors of the operating system change to offer better contrast, and the colors are propagated from Windows high contrast mode into the site's style to ensure that the site is offering as much accessibility as the operating system itself. Now, in this case, you can see how CodePen looks in high contrast mode. I know that a lot of people are going to be like, OK, but my users are probably not going to be using Windows high contrast mode. And how often does that happen? First of all, you never know. Second of all, it's not just people with accessibility problems that use this. Sometimes you have power users using Windows high contrast mode because apparently, if you use max brightness and set the high contrast mode, it allows you to use your computer when you're out in the sun. So you have even power users using Windows high contrast mode today, and I'm one of them, by the way. So Windows high contrast mode provides users with a selection of 4 ready-made high contrast themes. The user can choose between high contrast 1, high contrast 2, high contrast black, and high contrast white. In addition, users can redefine any of the colors used and save their own custom high contrast themes as well. So I'm changing the highlight color in this demo. By default, it's going to be yellow. So if I change it to pink, you're going to see how that propagates. So even though the user starts with a default theme, they can customize that. They can save the theme so that they can keep applying it whenever they want to. Come on. I'm a little bit slow in that. Come on. Okay, I know. They can delete it. OK. And now if you go to CodePen, the highlight color has been changed from yellow to pink. So Internet Explorer and Edge have a vendor-prefixed MS High Contrast media feature, which allows developers to detect if the user is currently in Windows High Contrast mode and to apply specific additional style rules in that situation. But regardless of which specific color scheme a user has chosen, MS High Contrast Active, the last one, will evaluate to true even it will be true even if you choose any of the other themes. So it doesn't tell you which specific theme has been chosen. We can't really know exactly what theme the user has activated when Windows High Contrast Active is true. And even at the first 2 queries, even though we can know if the user is in the white theme or if they are in the black theme, we can't really know what colors they are using because they may have changed those colors, right? So we can't really guess what the colors are being used, and therefore we cannot adjust our UI because we don't know those colors. But this is by design, because all we need to do is ensure that our styles will work well in high contrast settings. So within the limitations set to us by high contrast mode. So when you tweak your products to work with high contrast mode, you should not bother trying to detect which colors are being used, because the main point of this is to not give us control, but to give the users control. And if we have control over the colors, then we may end up screwing the whole thing altogether. So it's recommended that you don't force any colors on the user when they choose to enable high contrast mode. You have to let go of the desire, which is super hard for designers, I know, but you have to let go of the desire to control the user interface and to use the UI as a tool to facilitate interaction, not design preferences. So Microsoft mapped the Windows high contrast colors to CSS system color keywords, so we can use those color keywords instead of set our own. So we can optimize our interfaces for high contrast mode, but we should not bother changing them completely. So these 6 colors, and my very bad handwriting, that the user chooses and that we don't know the values of are the colors that we can use in our CSS within the high contrast media query to optimize our product for high contrast mode. So let's go over a few of the most important things that you can do today in your CSS as part of your daily workflow that will optimize your products for high contrast mode without requiring a lot of work from you. Tip number 1. Don't use CSS background images to deliver content or convey information because they may be removed and because if the information is critical, it should not be background image. For icons, use inline SVG and style the SVG using system color keywords. So in this demo, I have an icon that has a color blue by default. I want to change that color to become more accessible in high contrast mode, but I don't want to specify which color I want to use because I should not do that. So instead, I give the SVG a fill color using one of the keywords provided by Windows high contrast mode, which in my case is window text. So when you use window text, you're telling the browser to set the color of the icon to be equal to the color of the text that is currently being used in Windows high contrast mode. Another thing is you can use current color, which does exactly the same thing. And you can also use highlight. So the highlight color, which is used on the tab at the top, is now being used for the icon. You can use one of the keywords provided by high contrast mode. Ensure that the images with transparency have enough contrast. If you can't do that, provide an opaque version with background color of the images instead if you can. So these logos are from my personal website. When I was testing it for Windows high contrast mode, I realized that a lot of the logos have really bad contrast. So one thing I can do is either remove these transparent images and use opaque images like I'm doing with the signature, or I can inline the SVG and set the color of the SVG to be current color. When you use current color, which is a variable that has been in CSS since forever, you're literally telling the browser to go pick or to get the current color, the current value of the color property, which is the current color of the text, and use that as a value for the fill color on my SVG. Another example where using background images is not a good idea and where using PNGs with transparency is a bad idea is if you're using things like checkboxes and you're providing them as in the code pen above. If you view that code pen in high contrast mode, since the checkbox is black and the background becomes black, the checkbox becomes invisible. So you could avoid that by providing a PNG. But again, I never use PNGs for checkboxes today. We should probably be using SVG because not only is it accessible, but it also allows us to create some really neat animations like these as well. So an article on the Windows blog mentions that Microsoft Edge will no longer remove background images, so you can keep background images, you can use them, but first of all, don't use them for critical information. And second of all, you need to test, because sometimes you can end up with something that looks completely broken, like the Stripe website here, which initially looks like this. Or you can find that your UI looks pretty OK, like Harry Roberts' website. So he has his image as a background, and it looks just fine. So it's up to you if you want to keep background images, but make sure you test them in high contrast mode. Tip number 2, replace shadows. If you have drop shadows, replace those with borders in high contrast mode, because shadows are going to be removed in high contrast mode, so you want to replace them with something else. Borders is the next best thing. One tip you can do is add a transparent outline or a transparent border to anything that needs a border in high contrast mode, because if the border is transparent by default, it's going to get a color in high contrast mode, because high contrast mode is going to apply a color to it. This is, I think, what I'm mentioning in tip number 3. If your elements have a background color that is removed in high contrast mode, apply a border to the element instead. For example, buttons are one of the most common UI elements that are usually designed to have a background color, but if you view those buttons in Windows high contrast mode, they're not going to have a background anymore. The background color is removed. So what you can do is you can add a transparent border to all of your buttons by default, and that way you know that in Windows high contrast mode, they're going to look just fine. Again, this is particularly important to buttons and any other input types similar to it. Number 4, as we already mentioned before, you should never use background colors to convey information or deliver content. But I have a specific use case in this case here that I want to talk about, which are color swatches and design systems. They are usually created as empty elements which have 0 semantic meanings. And because the color is applied as a background color, if you view those design systems in Windows high contrast mode, you're going to get something like this. the design system becomes completely useless, or the color swatches become completely useless. So we need to be able to mark up our swatches in a more semantic way that is immune to changes in environments like that. There was an article by, by Taylor on the ColdFront blog, in which he discusses that you can mark up colors in 2 different ways today. One of them is to use the input type color, which is a semantic color element. You can give it a label, which means that you describe it using text. And if you have an input type color, and if you view that in Windows high contrast mode, it's not going to be affected, and the color is going to be preserved. But input type equal color is not very good to use today because it doesn't have support. I think it's not supported in Safari today. But it is the ideal way to do this because you can give it a name with label. Its value is accessibly exposed by assistive technology. It will show up as the correct hue no matter what the environment the user is within. User style sheets leave it be. It's not going to be changed. And with appearance and some goofy WebKit pseudo elements, you can style it just fine. Browser support, as I mentioned, is not very good, so I'd probably not do that. There's an alternative thing you can do is to mark up your color swatches using SVG. So you have a figure. A figure can have a fig caption, and the image, instead of being an image of something, whatever it is, you can have the SVG inside of it. The SVG would contain a rectangle that has a color of the swatch that you want. You give a label to the SVG, a meaningful label, and you can describe it more in the fig caption on the figure element. And I was recently positively surprised to see that Mozilla's style guide is using SVG for their swatches, which is pretty awesome. So if you view this in Windows high contrast mode, you're going to see the colors appearing just fine. So I'm almost out of time. So I'm going to go over this section really quickly. The gist of this section is to make sure that you never remove the focus styles on your website because it is a requirement in order to consider your website accessible. Avoid overriding default browser styles in general unless you provide a better alternative. And generally speaking, it is better to provide an alternative because focus styles are very inconsistent across browsers. The best one is in Chrome, but the ones in Firefox and MS Edge are kind of barely visible in most cases. So the focus indicator, ideally, you want to apply a focus style, but ideally, you want it only to be applied when the user has focus using the keyboard, not on mouse focus. And this is one of the battles that I always have to fight with designers that I work with, is they hate the focus styles, but I need to add the focus styles. So by default, when you apply the focus style in CSS, it might look something like this. When you apply it using the focus selector, it is applied to all of the elements when the element receives focus on keyboard or on mouse interaction. Now, as it so happens, today CSS has a focus visible selector, which allows you to apply the outlines or the focus styles, whatever that is, to an element only when it receives focus via keyboard. However, browser support for focus visible is currently very low, but you can either use a polyfill if you need to provide support for non-supporting browsers, or if you prefer a pure CSS-only solution that can be applied as a progressive enhancement. There is this really cool set of rules that I am completely in love with. So what's happening here? You start by applying the focus styles to your button in this case. By default, these are the focus styles that are going to show up on mouse and on keyboard. Okay? And then you have this rule. So when the button focus, not focus visible. If you read that in human language, it says, when the button receives focus that is not focus visible, meaning that when the button receives focus that is not keyboard focus, meaning that when the button receives focus that is mouse focus, for example, if the user clicks it and focuses it using a mouse, you undo all of the styles that you've defined in the first rule. So if a browser supports focus visible, they'll only get the styles, the focus styles when the element or when the button receives focus via keyboard. And if a browser does not support it, they will get it on mouse click as well. And if you want, you can add some very fancy, more exciting button focus styles that are specific to focus visible. This solution is suggested by Patrick Klauke in one of his articles, but as he mentions, until you can absolutely guarantee without any doubt that all of your users will have a browser that supports focus visible, you will always have to either polyfill or use the combination of focus not focus visible plus an optional stronger focus visible rule. So either provide a polyfill if you want all of the browsers to have the same experience, or use this as an enhancement today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. That's incredible. I'm sorry to